Hey everybody, David Pruess here for the ChessDojo again, and today we're going to do the third video in this mini series on chess strategy. If you missed the first two videos, you probably need to go back and do them. The series is called What to Do, and it addresses situations in a game that you might find yourself in where there's nothing violent, aka tactical, going on, and you sort of ask yourself what to do and you don't really have a good answer, and what you need is some kind of strategical idea how to improve your position when you're not calculating a bunch of captures and checks and threats and mates and pawn promotions and all that sort of stuff. So today we are going to move on to the exercises. This is going to be a first set of 5 exercises. And there's a second part with another set of 5 exercises to follow. So depending on how you do today, you may want to keep an eye out for or find the next video after this one. Here's how it's going to work though. The very important mechanism is going to be you're going to need to repeatedly pause your video to think about the positions that I give you. So 5 times in this video, I will give you a position. You will pause the video and try to ask yourself what you might be able to do in that position. There will be a handy list for you on the side of the position that shows the different kinds of things that one might do in a chess position. So you can refer to that list as you like to come up with ideas. And then you're going to try and come up with some ideas. I don't want you necessarily to just come up with one idea and say, this is the best idea. I would like you, if possible, to come up with a couple options in each position of different things that you could do, be that improving a piece or trading a piece or opening a file or whatever it might be. Come up with a couple ideas. You may, as you come up with them, have some inclination as to which you'd prefer or which you think is objectively strongest or whatever, and that's fine, and you can think about that a little bit if you'd like to. But the goal here is really to sort of come up with a few ideas. And when you feel like you've thought about the position sufficiently, and for different people, this could be anywhere from, 2 to 20 minutes per position, and I would think that 5 minutes might be average, but it really depends where you are in your chess strategy development. When you feel like you've thought about it enough and you've kind of got your idea, you can pause the video. You can unpause the video, and then you can hear me discuss different ideas. And I think for every single position, I will probably be offering multiple possible ideas. So it won't be a straight, you got it right, you got it wrong kind of exercise. It's an exercise of thinking in a certain way, and then we discuss, and there's not always one right or wrong answer. There's some different answers, and I tell you what I consider and how I came up with my idea, and you can compare it to yours. One tip in general for doing exercises also, you don't need to do it, and many of you may not want to or be reluctant to do it, or maybe you've only got 2 minutes and you're on a crowded bus with a cell phone or some horrible situation where you can't really do real chess training. But in general, it's always good to write down your answers. It's like in a chess game, you have to make a move and hit the clock. You can't tell your opponent, I was going to play knight e4, and then your opponent says, oh, but then I have this move, and you say, yeah, I was just thinking about knight e4. I wasn't really going to play it. Instead, I'm going to play knight d5. So in general, writing down our answers, committing to some idea, even though, as I've told you, the scoring on this is non-existent and certainly not rigorous, but committing to an idea, writing down answers is almost always a good idea in any kind of chess exercise practice situation, and that applies outside of chess as well, of course. All right, so let's get into it. I hope that this will be lots of fun for all of you. So right below me, handy list of things that you could do. If you don't know what they are, again, refer to the previous 2 videos, and then you will have some idea. Let's get into this first one, and it is black to move in this position here. And the question is, what could or should black do to improve their position if there are no immediate captures, threats, tactics, etc. going on here? So pause your videos. This is your first time, so you might not get it quite right. Pause your videos, and I'm going to launch right into the answer as soon as you unpause. See you in a few minutes. All right, welcome back. Congratulations on all that great work that you just did. All right, so let's look at this position. Things that could come to mind, are there any black pieces that could be improved? And the answer is actually very few. This is a position which stands out as the black pieces being really, really beautifully placed. Basically with one exception, I would say. There's only one piece that stands out as, maybe we could find a better square for it, right? It's the only piece I haven't highlighted. And yeah, this piece has almost no scope, and certainly one could not argue it's in its best possible square. And not only that, it's interfering with the queen's defense along the second rank and the rook that wants to perhaps wink at the white queen on e2. So the bishop is sort of poorly placed, and that's the only piece that really strikes me as being a piece that would ask for some improvement. Man, the black pieces are glorious. And overall, seeing the black pieces on such good squares would give me a feeling like black's position is probably good and that we could look for something good to do. Now, the number one good thing to do for black in the open Sicilian is to play d5. So the number two was maybe rook takes c3 and exchange sacrifice. Those are the two kind of things I look to do when I'm excited about how good my position is. And here there's no rook takes c3, so d5 is to some extent the super obvious move to any experienced Sicilian defense player. And then you could get into calculations and say, well, d5, it looks like there's three white pieces covering that square. Are we going to lose a pawn? Maybe, again, if you're an experienced Sicilian player, you know that often you can play d5 as a pawn sack, so that doesn't deter you, and then you start calculating. Anyway, one big idea for us is d5. And what's the idea behind d5 in the Sicilian? Well, it's to trade this pawn here, which is backward on a semi-open file. We're trading a pawn that's sort of weak for a pawn that's generally less weak. And if you take these pawns off the board, then usually black has an advantage in central presence from the remaining center pawn on e5. So you could consider that to be building strength in the center in a way, although building strength is more about bringing a lot of pieces somewhere. It is sort of trading a piece, but it's trading a pawn, so it's opening lines. It is improving our position in the center. It is trading off a weakness of ours on d6. You can also see it as improving the bishop on e7 and the rook on e8 by creating action. This is one of the few positions where I think there is one correct answer, and it is the first one that comes to mind for me, which is d5. But I'm going to give you a couple other ideas. The other move that would occur to me in this position would be the move bishop to f8. And the idea here is that we're slightly improving the position of this rook and bishop. The bishop by getting out of the way of the rook, right? And all the other pieces. So it just tucks away, gets out of the way of everybody, and then the rook is felt a little bit more powerfully. And this is because often when you play d5 and white takes it, you want to then push e4. So you might calculate, and this is not particularly a video about calculating, but you might calculate this idea here. d5, pawn takes d5, e4. And you see the rook is involved in this in some way, right? And this is the push that's supposed to discoordinate the white pieces, cut off defensive d5, and let black, then take on d5 at some point soon, hopefully. Recover their pawn, take over the center. And sometimes this e4 move might not work tactically. And if the bishop were already on f8, there's a better chance the d5 and e4 would work tactically. Okay, so bishop f8 would be a slight improvement of the piece with the same idea that we're trying to make progress in the center with this d5 pawn push. I know that in the game, a fairly strong player came up with the idea of improving the queen by going queen b8 to a8. So that might be something some of you think of to increase pressure on e4. And, it is arguable that the queen might be slightly better on a8 if the e4 and d5 squares are just the most important squares, and then you're playing d5 and the queen is right where it needs to be. So this is a perfectly reasonable idea. You could also argue the queen's just as good on c7, where she's sort of got more general centralization and, she can adjust and do. So queen a8, she's doing the most important thing, let's say. On queen c7, she's not doing the most important thing, but she can quickly adjust to different things that come up. And on a8, she's got less ability to adjust and react to a changing world. So, you could argue that queen 8 improves the queen or that it doesn't improve the queen. It's kind of a tricky question. I think it takes 2 moves and it doesn't threaten to win the pawn on e4. So I think it's unlikely that that's going to be the best, but in positions like this, there might be one where it is the best, maybe a position where white's having more trouble defending e4, maybe a position where the queen's already on b8. Instead of playing d5, you would take the time to play queen a8, but here, because it's 2 moves, maybe you don't. So it's good to consider all these ideas, whether or not they happen to be the best in each position. Now, if you look at the position and ask yourself from the perspective of where is black better or stronger, you would think where there's like the b5 pawn and some pressure on the c file. So the more obvious way to look at this position would be to try and make some progress on the c file. And often that can be done with a move like knight takes a3. It can be a tricky tactic where if your opponent takes with the rook, you play b4 and win back your piece. And if the opponent takes with the pawn, you take the knight. But here, white's put a rook on d3, specifically stopping this idea, right? So that idea is kind of stopped in its tracks. So we don't have knight takes a3. We don't really have knight takes b2. It's not super easy to improve our advantage along the c file, but I think there might be one plan that we could use, so I'll mention it, which is we could play for a5, b4, unseating the knight on c3 and opening up the file. The knight would have to either come to d5 where we trade it and change the central pawn structure, plugging the d file with the pawn. It also frees us for e4. So that can often be good for black. Just permit me to do this. I know the pawn's hanging. Sometimes it can be good for black to force this move here and make this change in the pawn structure. Then you can advance with e4. You've got a way to improve this bishop now. So sometimes that can be desirable, and if the white knight had to retreat instead of going to d5, that's almost always desirable for black, right? Because now white's losing control of d5 and e4, which are super important squares, and the c files become more tender, right? Where if we make some move with the knight, we'll be making a threat on c2. So from the idea of building up strength or trying to increase the pressure somewhere where we have perhaps the advantage already with the nicely placed knight, pressure from the rook and queen, and the space from the b5 pawn. The plan would be to defend b5 in order to play e5, a5, and then to play b4. So that could be bishop c6 or queen b6. Basically 2 ways about it, right? So queen b6, the queen defends this, and then you play a5, b4. Or bishop c6, and then I don't know, here, queen b7, and the queen can get behind this as well. But then we have to watch out for knight a5, so, watch out for that if you go for that. You also don't necessarily need the queen on b7 to do it. You could maybe play a5 in this situation with just the bishop doing it and go for b4. So, the basic plan, a5, b4, up to you in different positions to see how to defend the b5 pawn to make that happen here. Bishop c6 and queen b6 seem to be 2 other ideas we could use. All right, if you need to pause and reflect on this position a little bit more, comparing what you thought to what I thought, go ahead. Otherwise, there's another moment to pause in the very next position. We advance to position 2. This one here is also black to play. Pause if you want to think about it. And then I will launch into it. So looking at this position, what occurs to me are that both black rooks could be improved and that black has some strength at e4 and d3, like a pretty decent self-defending space advantage, cramping white a little bit, either in the center or towards the king side. So First of all, it would not occur to me to look for any building strength on the queen side or any opening lines on the queen side. My first thought would be to improve the rooks and try and dominate the d file with doubled rooks. That improves 2 pieces, builds on my strength, and there's only one open file on the board. When there's only one open file on the board, that open file is usually, or often, somewhere between often and usually, very valuable. So if I'm thinking, wow, I can, add almost 35 to 40% of my army to the game that are not in the game right now, and in a way that's likely to be highly effective and put pressure on the opponent, sign me up. That's really exciting. Another thing you could do is you could look for a way to try and generate a threat against the white king. The white king has a solid pawn defense and a bishop defending him, but the e4 and d3 outpost from black, what it does is kind of cuts white's pieces off, right? So that if you wanted to bring the white queen to the king side, it seems very hard to do, right? Same with this rook, right? So kind of splitting the board with this setup here gives us the idea of, we could go attack on the king side and the opponent wouldn't be able to bring as many forces there. Our queen and knight can get there easily. Again, me personally, I would want to have 1 or 2 rooks involved before I would go for this, but for argument's sake, you could do something like h5, h4 as an idea to weaken the white king. Also, maybe the idea h3, see which way the bishop goes and cramp the king, set up for queen g2 checkmates at some point. So h5, very, very logical. You'd want to have something in mind against h4, whether it be absolute insanity with g5 or something else, or just, okay, now we've seen how you've set that up, and then we proceed from there. Otherwise, there is the idea of attacking h2 with the queen and knight. So you could go knight g4 with the idea of queen h6 or queen f5, and you could poke either f2 or h2 and see what pawn weakness you create from white. That would be creating a weakness, right? And then afterwards, you would look for a way to attack that weakness or open a line in that area. These are great ideas for things to do on the king side, but for me, certainly I would want the rooks out first. Also, if you look at d3 and e4, they're defended, but white's probably going to fight back against them, right? So you don't want these 2 things to collapse before your kingside attack crashes through. If you saw a way to sort of decisively attack the white king within 4 to 5 moves, I would say, sure, forget about the rooks, go for it. But here, white's going to be able to break this up within, honestly, your checkmating attack would have to be even faster than I said. It would have to be like 2 moves, because you have to understand that your opponent is going to play moves like, f3 or rook d1, bishop f1, queen d4. They're going to play moves to try and break up this. And if you look at it, the bishop is defended once and attacked once, so it's barely defended. The pawn on e4 is attacked twice and defended 3 times, so it's mildly overprotected at the moment, but certainly the idea of, defending either of these squares more will give you a lot more time and strength to later build your attacking threats. So that would be my priority. I'm almost certain I would play rook a to d8 here, maintaining the flexibility of rook fe8 or some other use of that rook, although most likely I'm going to play rook d8, rook d6, and the second rook to d8, and it won't really matter in which order I do it. And rook fd8 could be just as good because it leaves the a5 pawn, the a7 pawn defended against the move queen a5. If you go rook here, you have to reckon with white going pawn hunting over there. And that might be annoying enough that actually I choose rook d8. But that's in the calculation sphere. First, we just need to come up with our ideas. So this position, clear example of we haven't quite finished development, right? We're right on the borderline between the opening and the middle game. A lot of people forget that they're not in that they need to develop the rooks. Like they get all the minor pieces out and the queen out, and then they stop developing and they start playing the middle game without the rooks. So this is a position where it's really screaming at you to not forget the rooks. All right, on to the next position, position 3. This position here is black to play as well. And one interesting thing to note is that the players who sent in these games or these positions from their games, and thank you very much to all of them, right? Thank you to the people in the dojo Discord who sent in very, very good example positions for this exercise. 8 out of 10 positions they sent me were with black. So I, from that, surmised just a little bit less comfort and familiarity with the strategic ideas for black, or just a little less comfort, right? Playing black, a little less confidence. Okay, so let's look at this position here. Black has, in theory, traded the light squared bishop. That would be their bad bishop if it were inside the chain on d7. But actually, we can guess that that bishop came out to f5 very early, and that white played the extremely impressive maneuver, bishop e2 to d1 to c2, a 3-step crawl to trade their theoretically good bishop for black's bad bishop. Despite the humiliation of that, white's position is not necessarily so bad. And when I look at this position as black, actually the first thing that I think of is in terms of preventing the opponent. Hopefully, if you wanted to think about this, you've already paused it and come back and you got the drill. Okay, when I look at this position, the first thing I think is, gosh, white's ready to play the move e4 pretty much. I better watch out for that. If white plays e4, they can gain a bunch of space in the center. They could potentially weaken my c4 pawn if I choose to trade, or they could gain even more space if I let them play e5. So I would be quite concerned about the potential for white to expand with e4. That looks very strong, and I doubt that I have anything active or aggressive to do myself that's going to take priority faster or be more important than what white's doing. So my first thought is, okay, white's about to play e4. Can I prevent it, or if not prevent it, like prepare for it, right? Be in the best position possible to survive it, deal with it, stay alive as it comes. And to do that, one of the things I have to think about is when white plays e4, am I going to want to trade it or allow the move e5? Honestly, my personal preference is to allow e5 all the way. Because if on e4 I trade, and let me just mark time to put that position on the board for you. This is what we're trying to visualize, a situation like this pawn structure here. I'm not saying there may be tactics, maybe knight takes c4, not knight takes e4. Maybe knight takes e4 is bad because the b2 pawn hangs it. I just want to show you the pawn structure for a second, right? When I look at this pawn structure, this pawn is giving white more space than this one. The white rook on this file is going to be pretty well placed, and white's going to have a potential outpost on e5. The c4 pawn feels a bit weak to me. I'm a bit unhappy with this position here. From a positional standpoint, right? Again, I may be not showing the right example because of queen b2, right? But just structurally, I'm concerned about that. So in general, I may be more open to letting white play e5. I move back. White gets a lot of space towards the king side, but it's still work for them to set up an attack there. It still emphasizes me having the nice light squared pawn control with the light squared bishop's gone. The bishop on f4 becomes bad with the pawn on e5. So good luck to the king, but I have some positional trumps and hopes there. Okay, so now basically we could look at this from a perspective of, we could try to be prepared to play e4, and then we take on e4 from black's perspective, right? We could try to use this queen takes b2 idea maybe to delay e4 tactically. Like maybe, and this gets into the realm of calculation, but chess sometimes does, even when it's strategic. Maybe we could plan to play knight takes e4, right? And then the idea is when they take, they didn't have the opportunity for knight takes c4, and maybe we've calculated that queen e4, queen b2 is good enough for us. So that's one option. We could try and play some move where we think we're ready to answer e4 with knight takes e4. The other option is we prepare to allow e4, e5 and think, where do we want our pieces when that happens if we can't stop it? And the second most obvious thing in this position after noticing that white's about to play e4 is our own strength. Where would we want to build strength? Where's our position good? Well, the space on the queen side with the c4 pawn, right? It's blocked at the moment, but we've got nice, strong pawns on light squares. Light squared bishop's missing. If a knight of ours could ever get to d3 or something, it could be monstrous. And the obvious, so to speak, I shouldn't throw that word in, honestly, because obviously the people watching this video are going to be people, hopefully, for whom it's the right level, and they don't know all the plans, and that's why they're watching it. So let me just, instead of saying obviously, let me say the natural plan when you've got a really strong pawn is to build strength in that area, and one of the famous ways to do that is to set up a pair of pawns. Okay, so b4 and c4. And again, folks, this becomes an instinct at some point. Like when you've been playing chess for several years, you see a position and you just see where your strongest pawn is, and you just look if you can put a second pawn next to it. And it's just like, and that's what you're supposed to get from this series of videos. Partly is like the tools to start figuring that out. But then it's also just the experience of playing hundreds of games, seeing hundreds of games, and actually seeing the moves get played out in practice. So the most typical plan here would be to put this pawn on b4 next to this pawn, possibly supported by the a5 pawn, so that if it gets captured, you could take with the pawn if you want. Though taking with the knight and sinking it on d3 is not bad. Taking with the piece is not bad because you can pressure the b2 pawn along the open b file if it'll let me make an arrow. Maybe it won't let me make an arrow because b8's covered by white's bishop. Okay, there we go. We could pressure this if we play b5, b4, and white's pieces don't have a lot of space in this area. So our strength is the opponent's weakness. So we could just prepare to say, hey, e4 and then maybe e5 are coming. Let's just continue with the plan we said when we said c4, and let's go b5 and b4. Okay? And if we're going to do that, then oddly our queen, which was doing something aggressive on the queen side, is actually in the way. And when I first saw this position sent to me, my very first idea was queen to d8, which looks like weird retreating the queen, but she needs to be out of the way of b5, and I like my queen to be centralized until it's really, really clear where a fight has started, because she can both respond to defensive needs on the king side or switch back to aggressive intentions on the queen side very, very quickly from here. So I like her on a centralized square as opposed to something like queen a6 or queen a5, which is maybe stronger for attacking on the queen side, but we're still several steps away from the attack, and there's that lack of flexibility where if e4, e5 and white's attack becomes real, I can't defend with her as well. So my first instinct seeing this entire position was, well, first I was worried about e4, and then I was like, I probably can't do anything about it. So then I thought, well, queen d8, she's ready for defense, and I clear the way for b5, b4. So that's one thing we can do, queen d8, preparing b5, b4. Another thing that you could do here is you could defend the c4 pawn so that you're ready for e4 taking. A preventative idea would be something like knight a5. You defend c4, and now if white plays e4, they're almost surely losing a pawn without sufficient compensation because c4 is defended, right? So there's not really any room for any trickery for white. b7's also defended if they play rook b1 against your queen at some point, right? I doubt that white has any tactical resources that would keep black from just winning a pawn very happily here. So you could play knight a5 to try and prevent e4. But if white plays, let's say rook b1 defending b2, planning to play e4 next, I'm not sure how happy we are about the knight having moved off to a5 out of the center. Rook b1 has improved white's rook on a1 slightly, because now the rook's opposite the queen, the b2 pawn's defended. But now white's got the option of knight e5 with this knight over here, and also e4 coming from the very next move. To me, this preventative idea is pretty ineffective if we just consider the idea of the move rook b1, preparing what white still wants to do. I feel like white's preparation trumped our prevention. So the prevention was probably not even worth doing in this case. Another move that can sometimes be played in this position is h6. This is preparing e4, e5, knight h7. And it might be followed up with a move like rook e8 here. And a rook e8 is going to be well placed if white surprises us by trading instead of pushing, which they can do, right? You have to understand white doesn't have only one single option. They can trade, they can push, they can build the pressure while leaving those two options hanging over us. But part of the idea here, and I'm back to queen d8 here, by the way, folks, but part of the idea here is that we've set up that the knight can go to h7. And this gives us flexible use of the f8 square for the knight and the bishop to defend our slightly cramped king position. Just keeps a little bit more defensive resources around the king than if the knight goes to d7 in some cases. And sometimes it's equivalent, but there's also knight g5 in some cases. So that's one other idea, is you could play h6, and that's some kind of like deep thinking about what squares you're going to want when your opponent eventually pushes forward in the center with an idea of an even more eventual kingside aggression. So that's a reasonable idea. Similarly, a very flexible move is rook e8, saying, I see this is coming, and I'm clearing the f8 square for these pieces to defend, and I'm prepared against e takes d5. So this could be like a slight improvement of the rook, right? We improve that piece. Not super mysterious since white's probably playing e4 soon. So there you have it. There's no clear answer to this one, but a few ideas for you. We could get the queen out of the way to start playing b5. We could play rook e8 to mildly improve the rook. We could play h6. We've got the idea of prevention with knight a5, but I don't really buy that one. So hopefully you're okay with. Sometimes, we make a list of 4 or 5 ideas and 1 or 2 of them can be discarded as not really being effective. Like we think like, oh, let me open a file with e5. And then you go, no, it's not going to happen. That's okay. And honestly, it helps you make a decision in a game if you can actually reject some ideas. All right, on to position number 4. Now, we've got a pair of positions in a very similar structure, but I think sent in to me by different players. So in this position here, it is black to play. And yeah, pause the video real quick and then come back to me. All right, what can black do? Well, the first thing that occurs to me in this position is that black is not at all done with development. And so I see just 3 pieces screaming at me. And usually the bishop screams the most shrilly, and the rooks are kind of like they're a rumbling problem in the background. But the minor pieces get our attention first. If there's a minor piece clogging the ranks, it's like, what am I even supposed to do for the rooks? Get this bishop out of here. So that bishop needs to be improved. The player who played this game, I think, tried to improve that bishop. I think they were thinking between b6 and b5 in the game. I'm not sure which one they chose, but those are definitely both ideas, b6 and b5, to improve that bishop. Comes to mind. So there's a lot of other ideas, and the player who sent me this also said, they were confused by how many options they had. Should they play knight f4? Should they play knight e5 with either knight? There's so many options. But I would say you could narrow down your options to options that develop the bishop. Nothing looks stupid or wrong about any of these knight moves, or even queen f4 is maybe a move, though it requires some tactical care that you're not losing a pawn, right? But there's nothing necessarily super bad or wrong looking about those moves, except that this has to be a priority. Unless these knight moves are on the verge of winning a pawn, unless they're really, really juicy moves that are creating major threats, we need to improve this bishop first. And so largely in a position like this, you can be guided by the needs of development because you're still in the opening, and really pare down your list of ideas. There's a million things you could do in this pawn structure that we can talk about in the next position. Like you could try and put one of your rooks on one of these files that are semi-open, or you could try and put your rooks behind your pawns where you've got a majority, and you could try to build strength. We'll talk about all that a little bit more in the next one. But here I would say really like in the opening, you need to be developing your pieces. We're still in the opening. We need to develop pieces. And so that falls under improve a piece. And it's just an overwhelming directive in the opening. So that means we're down to really 3 ideas to consider here: E5, B6, and B5. All right. I think that we can even order which of the 3 are the best. And if you didn't think about these ideas when you had your first link, you could pause the video now again and try and figure out which of these 3 you like best, now that I've told you that bishop c8 is dictating play, the worst piece needing to be improved in order to be able to improve the rooks as well, right? Okay, so in terms of what square the bishop would be best on, the bishop would be best on the square b7. But in terms of where on the board we want to push pawns and potentially build strength, where we have our majority, e5 is a move which we really want to play strategically. It's a strong move for us, right? It's taking away the d4 outpost from the white knights. That's part of the point of having a central presence, is that your opponent's pieces should become worse, right? So e5 and f5, that's the kind of stuff we want to be playing. That's where we're excited to make our position stronger than the opponent and build up strength, which is a beautiful thing to do in chess. So that's the move we want to play. That said, b7 is the best square for the bishop on the board. So if we wanted to maximize improving just the bishop, it would be b7. But if you think about the harmony of the whole game and position, I think it might make more sense to play e5 right here, stop knight d4, put the bishop on, maybe a second-rate square like e6 or g4, and develop this rook. But now let's look at the alternatives on the other side of the board, okay, which is important. If you go b5, this I think is the worst of the 3 options, because we're advancing the pawn further on the side of the board where we're potentially weak, and we also have to be sensitive to the colors of the bishops and the possible weak color complexes on the board. Right now we have no dark squared bishop as black, and we only have 1 pawn covering dark squares. We've got our queen well placed covering dark squares, so does the opponent. The queens are well placed by both players. They've each realized that the queen should be on the square of the traded bishop. But here, we're giving white knight c5 basically forever. Queen c5 maybe even. And also targets for the bishop. a4 from white here or on the next move, maybe with some prep. But in general, the move a4 is going to highlight some real problems with the move b5, because whether we trade or push or get traded on b5, we're going to have a weak, isolated pawn on the queen side that white's going to be able to harass. And the queen side is where white is going to have the advantage with 3 pawns versus 2. Also, notice we're behind in development, and b5, by pushing further, makes it easier for the opponent to start making threats and opening lines before we've caught up on development. So even the more desirable positional move here, b4 from black, this is a pawn move that's costing development tempo, right? This is more desirable because with this trade here, white's b2 pawn is not as strong an extra pawn. It's behind this pawn, and black can use the b file to pressure it, right? But the problem is we're playing pawn moves when we're behind in development, and we're opening up still a part of the board where white is stronger. And a move like rook to c1 screams at me that black could be getting into major trouble here, right? Now white's threatening to win a pawn on b4. So we might be potentially playing a move like this to avoid c takes b4. Now we're just developing the opponent's pieces even more for them, right? Look at the pressure we're putting on ourselves here. From black's perspective, we've exerted energy to improve the white rooks. We weren't quite ready for this. Maybe you can escape without losing here as black. Maybe you're not going to lose that knight to this deal on the file. But you need one heck of a move to not lose here, right? Because white's ready to go knight c5 or bishop e4 or knight d4. And this is rickety. This is rickety. So that would be a very, very, very risky, dangerous approach, b5, both because of light squares, which side of the board you're stronger or weaker on, and who's ahead in development. So if you're going to try and put the bishop on this beautiful square, you need to play the more modest move b6, which at least covers this weak square and the knight's approaches, so your bishop can live on b7 in some peace. It covers dark squares, which in general you need to do. It doesn't advance the pawns too far on the queen side, so you don't get into as much of a fight in the area of the board where you're a bit weaker and when you're behind on development. And now we can put the bishop on b7 and then start developing the rooks. And this should be acceptable position that you would get as black from this b6 move. b5, completely don't trust it. Okay, this should be acceptable. Notice that, you will have to keep the a6 pawn defended. But bishop b7 might be enough to do it. If white plays queen e2, maybe you have knight f4. You might see white playing g3 to limit that knight. We will have to keep our eyes on defending these two pawns, which is one of the things I don't love about moving anything on the queen side in this particular position. And so I would prefer e5. Be clear, everybody, I could be wrong about which move is better. There could be some specific variation or detail that a computer sees that tells it that that b6 is better than e5 here for some reason, or that potentially, here's one other move that could potentially be the best move, could be bishop d7, just getting the rook going as fast as possible. There might be some reason that because we're behind in development, we don't even have time for a pawn move here. And every pawn move gives different squares and openings and weaknesses. There could be some thing about this that allows white to threaten the e5 pawn with bishop takes g6, and if we play f6, then somehow white gets this diagonal first and plays queen c5. There could be something wrong with e5 because this is a slightly risky position from black. Being a tempo down in development, it may not seem like a lot, but it's still like you have to be a little bit careful anytime you're behind in development. So it's potentially possible this could be another move on our list. Bishop d7, the very, very safe, calm move, trying to improve pieces. Play rook d8, drop the bishop back to c8 as needed. Push no pawns, create no weaknesses kind of approach. Maybe one other move we could throw in the ring. All right, our last position for today. Good job to all of you on your work so far. I know that if you're working through this video at one go, it's very likely taking you between 80 and 120 minutes already at this point with one more position to go. Depending on whether you're spending 10 minutes with me and 10 minutes on your own, or 20 minutes on your own and 10 minutes with me. It's a lot of effort. I commend you on it. And hopefully, well, anyone who's doing that, I know they're learning something. So I don't have to say hopefully you're learning from it. All right, so here's the next one. You'll recognize the same pawn structure, right? Different bishops, dark squared bishops instead of light squared bishops. But now we can talk more about things that we could do if development were complete, right? Both players have, and props to them, right? They've brought the rooks out before playing a bunch of wild pawn pushes. Nobody launched an attack without their rooks this game. All the pieces are on somewhat reasonable squares. So if we talk about improving our pieces here, it's not going to be develop, dude. It's going to be like, which is our worst placed piece and does it have a slightly more ideal square, right? So it could be like, from white's perspective, it could be like, does this knight have an outpost somewhere where it does even more? Or same for black, right? Would this knight be even better on d5 than it is on f6? Or is it just walking into c4 at some point and it might as well stay where it is? Is it already on the best square? Or is there some way to bring the knight all the way around to c4 and bother white at b2 and the bishop's squares, take something away from the bishop? So it would be that kind of degree of improving a piece. Oh, pardons. Pause the video if you like. All right, I continue. Okay, so looking at this position, if we wanted to improve a piece, and this one is from black's perspective, I think the rooks are already probably pretty well placed. There is a way of playing this position where you put this rook over here or here to push the pawns more. Here it seems like we'd really have to give up the d file to rearrange the rooks, right? You would have to move this rook and then this rook, or you could more likely trade one rook so that you don't get as crushed on the d file and then move the other rook away. If you ever want to give up the fully open file, here's a little very, very general pattern. If you ever want to give up the fully open file in order to go for, I think It's black to play, but it's not letting me move for black. It's letting me move for white. Okay. Sorry, maybe this is from white's perspective. We'll cover both. So we could even do it from white's perspective. If instead of trading off all the rooks on the D file, you want to keep more rooks on the board to keep more play and more complexity and more winning chances, and you're thinking, maybe I'll put my rook here and then push this pawn up the board. Okay, if you ever want to do that, it's generally better to trade one rook and then go do your plan than to trade no rooks and seed the file when your opponent's going to be able to get doubled rooks on that file. Okay, from my experience, there is the idea you don't have to trade every rook just because there's an open file in chess. Like if you get a Petrov or an exchange French or an exchange Slav, you are not obligated to put every single rook on the open E file or open C file and trade every rook off. You're not. There are positions where you can cover the entry points on the file with your minor pieces and the rook can't really get in, and you can leave an open file to your opponent and keep a rook on the board for some other action where you expand or attack on some other part of the board. In those positions, you usually want to trade one rook before you do that and then keep one rook on the board. Rarely would you keep two rooks and give up this file completely. And part of the reason for that is when you step away, the doubled rooks allow them to prevent you from ever challenging them if you need to defensively, keep you from coming back to that file, allow them sometimes to do breakthroughs. It's extra to give them the doubled control of the open file. Okay, so let's just talk from black and white's perspectives for a moment here. We've got a pawn majority on either side. That's kind of the most obvious feature or imbalance in the position. If you were coming from a Jeremy Silman reassess your chess perspective, players have, similar bishops, similar knights, all the pieces are pretty well placed and nobody really has any weaknesses. So it's not attack a weakness for sure in this position. The most likely thing you could do is you could try to create a weakness or build a strength. Create a weakness would be a minority attack. And so for white, that would be something like f4, f5, trade this pawn and create a weak pawn to attack over there. For black, it would be b5, b4, create a weak pawn to attack. That's the minority attack. And building strength would be also what's called activating the majority. And that would be for black, trying to play e5 and f5, pawn duo there. And for white, it would be playing c4, b4, and maybe even then c5 and b5. Advancing that pawn majority, creating a head duo, building strength in that area, starting to take away squares from the black pieces there. And ultimately, you can even create a passed pawn if and when the game transitions towards an end game with these two majorities. So those are like the typical plans, honestly, from here. There's also the plan of just trading off rooks, right? We could fight over the D file. Both players are well enough placed and well enough developed that nobody should gain control of the D file unless the opponent makes a mistake. So if you play for the D file, expect your opponent to be able to just sort of trade off all rooks and for it to be kind of a wash. And so then you have to ask yourself, who would want to trade those pieces, right? That's on the list, trading a piece. Who wants to trade the rooks? And there's actually an answer to that in this position. Trading rooks is slightly favorable to white. The reason being white has the pawn majority that's further away from the kings, and black has the pawn majority in the center. A central pawn majority is worth more when it's able to kick pieces out of good squares and then transition into active play in a middle game. For example, pivoting from being strong in the center to attacking the king. When you're strong in the center, you often have the option to pivot to anywhere you want, right? So you don't have to have an advantage near the king to attack the king. If you have an advantage in the center, that kind of gives you the right to pivot almost anywhere. So you can turn that into an attack on the king. So basically trading off pieces devalues the central pawn majority a little bit and increases the value of the queenside pawn majority a little bit, or the far away from king pawn majority. So the idea of creating a passed pawn eventually and threatening to queen it is going to be much more potent in an endgame than in a middle game. Here, advancing these pawns super fast might, in some cases, just give black outposts on the d file as your pawn moves forward too fast. So. But in endgame, it's going to be nice every step forward you get with that pawn majority. So rook trades are actually going to favor white slightly, and literally a plan for white in this position could be something like, rook d8, rook d1, trade rooks, queen to d1 or queen to d4. See if your opponent wants to trade queens or give up the d file to your queen. You just repeatedly offer every trade and push the opponent's pieces off of their best squares, or black accepts all the trades and then you play a slightly better endgame. And with no weaknesses like this, if black rushes the king into good position, this position should be defensible in an endgame, but it's an idea to put pressure on your opponent and try and outplay them and beat them, right? Because obviously you can't just win in this position. All you can do is employ ideas to improve your position, and if you do a better job at that than your opponent, your position can keep getting better. And of course, random tactics will come up that might decide the game rather than the strategy, but you're pursuing a strategy. So a super long-term strategy here for white that's viable is you just start trading rooks and queens by putting them on the d file. That could slightly help white. The position's not well situated for a minority attack, in my opinion. If black goes for b5 and b4, they're liable to just leave their own isolated pawn weaker than whatever they do with white's majority. White is strong enough to meet black on the queen side. And I mean, we can already see b5 loses the pawn on a6. So we would have to prepare it. How do we prepare it? How do you even defend this? Rook a8, worsening the position of our rook. And then if we ever play b5 and white plays rook takes d8, we can't even take back with the rook because it's guarding the a pawn. So rook a8 doesn't look super attractive. Queen c6, white can trade the queen and go to the endgame, which we know slightly favors white, although it could be done from a defensive perspective for black. So there's no really good way to defend this. And even if there were, and then we played b5, I don't know that it would bring black any joy, as white could play queen b3 and then a4. And white's perfectly strong on the queen side. So you'd have to have a real advantage in piece activity to go for a quick b5, b4 in this structure and have it be helpful for black, I think. You have to have the advantage somehow in your piece placement to go for that idea. Similarly for white, I mean, what are we going to do with f4, f5? We're basically just weakening our king. And the second rank's open and central files are open, and then we open up this diagonal, and we're just asking for some kind of knight g4 followed by tactics from black. So moving this f pawn is not desirable, period, much less bringing it all the way to f5 and opening another file here. So this position is not a position for either of those minority attacks. It's a position for either trading or building strength. So white could play towards this plan, black could play towards this plan, or the players could trade pieces on the d file, or they could jockey for position with the knights and bishops, right? Like black could offer the bishop trade. Either player could get rid of back rank mate just to make it a little easier to fight over the d file. You're not going to get mated if you miss a little tactic. And yeah, each knight could try for some small improvements, and you could weigh the possibilities of knight versus bishop trades and say, is this going to be better position for the bishop or the knight, and should I avoid this trade or not? And that's that. This position is a fairly quiet one because both players have no weaknesses and have successfully developed every piece to a good square. It's the most grandmasterly position of any of the five in this first video. And yeah, no like mind-boggling, super thrilling plan, but hopefully still useful to see the little things that can be done from here. All right, take care. If you feel like you've aced this, then fairly well. You now know what to do in chess. And if you feel like there's still a lot to think about and you'd benefit from doing some more examples, there's another video coming soon. All right, take care, everybody.